The sea was black that morning, a living mirror of cold steel and forgotten prayers. Somewhere between the clouds and the waves, men prepared to die for skies they didn't own. Engines coughed awake like beasts behind bars, and the scent of oil mixed with the salt of the Channel wind. For the young pilots aboard HMS Indefatigable, there was no promise of return, only duty, and the hope their courage might outfly their fear. The Germans never believed the British could launch a fighter fast enough, light enough, and deadly enough from a floating strip of metal. But they hadn't met the Seafire Mk III, and that disbelief, that arrogance, would cost them dearly. The year was 1944. Europe was burning, skies torn open by tracer fire, and the Reich's proudest sons, the Luftwaffe aces, still ruled the air with ruthless confidence. They called themselves the Hunters. To them, the war was a game of skill, of precision, of domination. But that morning over the cold North Sea, a new player entered their board, and it came from the deck of a carrier, slicing the horizon like a silver ghost. Lieutenant David Fraser tightened his gloves and whispered a prayer that wasn't quite for God. "For Mum," he said under his breath. The deck officer's signal baton dropped, and the Seafire leapt forward with the scream of a wounded soul. The ship trembled, men ducked instinctively, and within seconds the plane was airborne, its propeller cutting the mist as it climbed toward the dawn. From his cockpit, the world looked calm, deceptively calm. Below, the steel carrier faded into a speck, and the clouds began to glow with a cruel kind of beauty. He checked his instruments. The needle trembled near 340, 345, and then 352 miles per hour. Off a carrier. Unbelievable. He smiled through clenched teeth. She's got wings, after all. But just beyond that horizon, the German aces were waiting. Men like Oberleutnant Karl Voss, a veteran of the Eastern Front, his Messerschmitt Bf 109 painted in kill marks like a tally of sins he no longer counted. He believed no British plane could match his speed, his climb, his precision. To him, the sea was the enemy's graveyard. What he didn't know was that the grave was waiting for him. The radar blips came like whispers. Command crackled in the headsets. Enemy inbound, 20 miles northwest. Multiple contacts. Likely 109s, David swallowed hard. His squadron leader's voice was calm, detached. The voice of a man who had already accepted his death long ago. "All right, lads, eyes open. Tight formation. Let's show them what a carrier fighter can do." The clouds swallowed them whole. Silence. Just the hum of the Merlin engine. Steady, comforting, like a heartbeat in chaos. Then a shadow flashed across the sun. Another. The sky erupted. Tracer rounds tore through the morning light, weaving ribbons of fire between clouds. David dove left, instinct guiding his hands faster than thought. The Seafire rolled gracefully, her wingtips slicing the air with surgical precision. "They're fast, too fast," shouted one of the pilots. But then David's voice broke through. "Stay tight! Don't run, climb." And that's when it happened. The Seafire, born from the legendary Spitfire but refined for the unforgiving sea, began to show her secret. Even burdened by the weight of carrier fittings and the salt-worn fuselage, she climbed like a ghost unchained. The Germans had never expected that. Karl Voss saw it too late. He pulled his Messerschmitt into a dive, expecting the British planes to falter. But the Seafire stayed with him. Steady, relentless, impossibly fast. 352 miles per hour off a carrier. It wasn't just a number anymore. It was a promise. One written in smoke and sacrifice. The two planes twisted through the clouds, sunlight flickering across their canopies like a strobe of death. Bullets traced the air between them. White-hot lines that missed by inches. David could see Voss's eyes for a moment. Wide, blue, proud. the look of a man who had never been hunted before. Then, silence, a single breath, and David pressed the trigger. The Seafire's guns spat fury. The Messerschmitt's tail shattered. Its engine caught fire, and for a heartbeat, the German ace became just another falling star in the dawn. David didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He just watched as the burning aircraft disappeared into the sea below, leaving behind a trail of black smoke that slowly bled into the horizon. He whispered again, softly, "For Mum." Down below, on the deck, the crew watched the sky in tense silence. And when the first Seafire broke through the clouds, victorious but scarred, a wave of disbelief rippled through the men. They had done it. They had outflown the Luftwaffe, but victory never comes free. Over the radio, static turned into screams. Another voice. Then nothing. One Seafire didn't return. Then another. The cost of speed, of bravery, of trying to outfly death, was always counted in silence. As the sun broke fully over the sea, the surviving pilots circled back toward their floating home. The deckhands raised their eyes, searching the clouds for more wings that would never return. The sound of the engines echoed like ghosts saying goodbye. That morning, the myth of German air superiority had been broken, not by arrogance, not by numbers, but by belief. The belief that even from the smallest decks, hope could take flight. Night fell like a curtain of smoke over the North Sea. The carrier's deck lights flickered weakly in the mist, each bulb fighting the darkness like a heartbeat refusing to stop. The wind howled through the rigging, carrying with it the faint scent of fuel, salt, and grief. No one spoke loudly. Not after a day like that. David sat on the edge of the deck, helmet still on his knees, staring into the black water that had swallowed his friends. Beside him, the ship's chaplain moved quietly, his coat flapping in the cold wind. "You got one of them, didn't you?" he asked gently. David nodded once. "Karl Voss," he murmured. "They said he had 29 kills." The chaplain hesitated. "And now?" David exhaled. "Now he's just another name the sea will forget." Far below deck, mechanics worked in silence, wiping down oil-stained parts, hands trembling with exhaustion. The Seafires had survived, barely. Their wings bore holes like open wounds, their paint stripped by salt and smoke. But they had done the impossible. They had flown faster than anyone believed they could. Word spread through the fleet. Whispers passed from ship to ship, like an old story retold in disbelief. "Did you hear? The Seafire hit 352, off the bloody deck." Sailors repeated it in awe, as though speed itself had become a kind of salvation. But for the pilots, numbers meant nothing that night. What they remembered were faces. The empty chairs in the mess hall, the smell of wet leather jackets still draped over hooks, the laughter that used to fill the air before takeoff. David found himself tracing the names carved into the back of a mess tin, crude initials scratched by his squadron, each one a promise to make it home. He remembered Lieutenant Andrew "Mac" McAllister, the loud Scot who always joked before missions. Mac had said that morning, "If we don't make it, at least let the bastards know we were faster than their precious 109s. His seat was empty now, his bunk untouched. Somewhere near midnight, the captain entered the pilot's quarters. He was a tall man with a face carved by wind and worry. "You boys did the impossible today," he said, his voice steady but hollow. "The Luftwaffe won't underestimate you again. But I want you to remember something. This ship doesn't just carry aircraft. It carries ghosts. Treat them well." He left the room without waiting for a response. Outside, rain began to fall. Soft at first, then harder, like tears hitting steel. The deck glistened, reflecting the faint glow of the horizon. David stood in the rain, face tilted up toward the sky he'd nearly died in. "Was it worth it?" he whispered. His voice barely carried past the wind. Then came the sound, distant, low, rumbling. Not thunder, engines, two of them. The crew scrambled, scanning the black horizon. "Friendly!" someone shouted. The radar confirmed it. Stragglers, survivors. A signal lamp blinked from the sky. One of the returning pilots, Sergeant Blake, landed hard, skidding across the wet deck before stopping inches from the barrier. Men rushed forward, pulling him out of the cockpit. His face was white, eyes hollow. "They got Mac," he said quietly. "But we got them all." David helped him to his feet, gripping his arm. "You did good," he said, though the words felt empty. Blake shook his head. "No one wins up there. We just last longer." By dawn, the sea was calm again, pretending nothing had happened. The gulls returned, circling the ship like restless spirits. The surviving Seafires were lined up along the deck, silent, scarred, beautiful, their engines still warm, like hearts that refused to stop beating. Later, in the briefing room, the squadron gathered for debrief. Maps sprawled across the table, cigarette smoke curling toward the low ceiling. "Enemy formation destroyed," the intelligence officer read aloud. 5 confirmed kills, 3 probable. 2 pilots missing. 1 confirmed dead. He looked up. No one spoke. David stared at the wall, mind replaying the dogfight in fragments. The flash of sunlight off the Messerschmitt. The scream of the Merlin engine. The moment Karl Voss looked back at him, eyes wide with disbelief. In that second, they weren't enemies. Just 2 young men, one realizing his legend was ending, the other realizing he was the one who'd end it. He remembered something his father had told him before the war. "Son, the sea will test your courage, but the sky will test your soul." Now he understood. When the meeting ended, he slipped a letter into the outgoing mailbag. It was written on thin, creased paper, the kind that never made it home dry. "Dear Mum," it began, "we did something today that no one thought possible. They said we couldn't fly that fast, couldn't take off from these ships, couldn't survive what we faced. But we did, and I wish I could tell you it feels like victory. But it doesn't. It feels like silence." That night, as the carrier sailed toward the fading edge of war, David climbed once more into his Seafire. The deck crew watched in silence as the engine roared to life. He didn't take off, not yet. He just sat there, eyes closed, listening to the heartbeat of the machine that had carried him through hell and back. Somewhere deep down, he knew the war would end soon. But he also knew men like him wouldn't know what to do when it did. The sky had become their home, their curse, their only truth. He whispered into the static hum of his radio, not to anyone in particular, but to the ghosts that lingered in the clouds. "We flew faster than they thought we could," he said. "But speed means nothing if you can't slow down." Spring 1945. The war's thunder was finally dying, but the silence that followed was heavier than any bomb. Across Europe, the fires dimmed, the skies cleared, and yet, for men like David Fraser, peace felt like a kind of exile. The roar of the Merlin engine still haunted his sleep, and the faces of those who didn't return still followed him in every reflection. The HMS Indefatigable sailed home through calm waters now, its decks no longer trembling with the rhythm of takeoffs and landings. The Seafires sat idle, wings folded like tired birds, their silver paint dulled by salt and time. For weeks, the pilots had waited for the official word. When it finally came, victory in Europe, there were no cheers, just a long, collective exhale. That night, they held a small ceremony on deck. A few dozen men, standing under a sky that finally showed stars instead of fire. The chaplain read quietly from a book whose pages were damp from the sea air. "They soared high, that freedom might live," he said. No one moved. Some bowed their heads. Others stared into the water where their friends had vanished months before. David clutched the mess tin in his hand, the one with all their initials carved into it, and traced each letter with his thumb. Mac, Jones, Ellery. The captain stepped forward. "Gentlemen," he said, voice breaking slightly, "the world will remember this war for the battles that changed its borders. But we will remember the skies, the wind, the sound of engines that carried us farther than fear ever could." David wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He could only nod. The sea was calm, deceptively gentle. The same sea that had taken so much. Somewhere beneath those waves lay the wrecks of both friend and foe, resting side by side in the cold silence of history. Later that night, David found himself in the hangar bay, sitting beside his Seafire. The air smelled of oil and memory. He ran his fingers along the fuselage, the chipped paint, the scars of flak rounds still embedded near the tail. "You did good," he whispered, as if the plane could hear him. "They said you couldn't do it. But you did." He remembered that first flight, the shock on the Germans' faces, the disbelief when a carrier-borne fighter kept up with their Messerschmitts. He thought of Karl Voss again, the German ace whose death still haunted him. Sometimes, in dreams, David saw him not as an enemy, but as a mirror. Two men, both young, both trained to kill, both wondering, in those final seconds, what all this speed was really for. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Blake, his surviving wingman. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. David smiled faintly. "Every day." Blake sat beside him, lighting a cigarette. "I heard they're scrapping the Seafires soon, replacing them with jets. Can you believe that? The bloody future's already here, and we haven't even caught our breath." David watched the smoke curl upward. "Maybe that's what the war was for," he said. "To teach us how to build something faster, deadlier, until there's nothing left worth saving." Blake chuckled softly. "You always were the poet, Dave." They sat there a long time, listening to the distant hum of the ship's engines, a familiar lullaby in a world that suddenly felt too quiet. Weeks later, when the ship finally returned to Portsmouth, the harbor was filled with flags, bands, and waiting families. But as David stepped off the gangway, he realized he didn't feel home. The streets were clean, the people smiling, yet something inside him had stayed out there, somewhere between the clouds and the sea. He rented a small room overlooking the water. Every morning, he'd walk to the cliffs, watching gulls glide over the waves, tracing invisible dogfights in the air. In his pocket, he always carried a single propeller bolt from his Seafire, the only piece he'd kept. Sometimes he'd see a young boy running across the fields with a toy airplane, laughing as it dove and climbed. And for a moment, he'd smile too, remembering the thrill, the rush, the feeling of flying faster than fear itself. But at night, when the wind picked up and the sea roared beneath the cliffs, the ghosts came back. The engine sounds, the radio crackle, the last words of Mac before his plane vanished into the clouds. "Tell Mum I'll be home for Christmas." He never was. Years passed. The war turned into stories, and the stories turned into myths. The Seafire Mk III became a forgotten hero, overshadowed by faster jets and louder victories. But in the hearts of those who flew her, she was more than metal. She was the heartbeat of a generation that refused to give up, even when the world told them they couldn't. One afternoon, David visited a museum in London. There, in a quiet corner, he found her, a Seafire Mk III restored to perfection, her propellers still gleaming. A small plaque read, "The Seafire, the fighter that defied the impossible." He placed his hand on the cold metal, eyes wet with memory. "You remember, don't you?" he whispered. 352 miles per hour, and every mile cost a life." A small boy nearby looked up at him. "Mister," he said, "did you really fly one of these?" David smiled softly. "Once," he replied. A long time ago, the boy grinned. Was it fast? David paused, looking into the reflection on the plane's surface. A younger face staring back at him for just a moment. Then he nodded. Yes, but not as fast as we thought. The sky always catches up with you in the end. As he turned to leave, the museum lights flickered softly across the Seafire's wings. For a heartbeat, he could almost hear it again. The thunder of takeoff, the cry of engines, the voices of his squadron calling through the static. He didn't look back. Some things are better left in the clouds. Decades drifted by like the tide. Slow, silent, unstoppable. The world changed its shape, its wars, its heroes. But for David Fraser, time didn't wash away the sound of those engines. It only made them quieter, until they became something like a heartbeat beneath his thoughts. The last time he heard a Merlin engine, it wasn't in combat. It was at an air show, 50 years after the war had ended. He stood among a crowd of families, children holding ice creams, old veterans leaning on canes. And then the sound came. That same rising howl of power, slicing the summer air in half. For a moment, every breath caught in his chest. He looked up. There she was. A Seafire Mk III, reborn from memory, her propeller glinting in the sunlight. The pilot pulled her into a graceful loop, dipping her wings toward the crowd as if saluting ghosts. The people cheered, but David didn't move. His eyes filled, not with pride, but with something heavier. Loss, gratitude, awe. The man next to him nudged his arm. Beautiful old bird, eh? Hard to believe those things flew off ships. David nodded slowly. Aye, he whispered. And faster than anyone believed. The man laughed. They say she hit 350 in her prime. Off a carrier deck. That's mad, David smiled faintly. It wasn't speed that was mad. It was the reason. That night, long after the crowd had gone and the field was empty, he walked up to the hangar where the Seafire was being stored. The mechanic recognized him instantly. The old photos still hung on the wall. You flew her kind, didn't you? The man said softly. David nodded. She's more than a machine to me. She's a promise kept. He stepped closer, hand trembling as he touched the wing's edge. We all wanted to be faster, he murmured, to climb higher, to win. But up there, speed wasn't freedom. It was the edge between being alive and being remembered. He closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, the years vanished. The roar of engines, the crack of gunfire, the smell of cordite and sea spray, the voices shouting over radio static. He saw them all again. Mac laughing in the ready room, Blake lighting his last cigarette, Voss's face frozen in disbelief as the sky turned to flame. And then, silence. He opened his eyes again, but for a moment, the hangar wasn't empty. In the faint reflection of the plane's surface, he thought he saw them. All the boys who'd never grown old, standing beside their machines, smiling like they did before takeoff. The living and the dead, side by side, forever caught between clouds and salt. He whispered, We thought victory meant surviving, but it meant remembering. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the hangar doors like distant applause. The stars shimmered above. The airfield. The same constellations that had once watched him climb through tracer fire. He tilted his head back and breathed in the cold night air, the same air he had once fought to stay alive in. As he walked away, his footsteps echoed softly on the concrete. Steady, unhurried, like a heartbeat finding its peace. Before leaving, he turned one last time toward the Seafire. Sleep well, girl, he said quietly. You earned it, the hangar lights flicked off. The engine that once defied the impossible now rested in silence, and, for the first time, so did David. Years later, after he passed, the museum added a new plaque beside the Seafire. It read simply, Lieutenant David Fraser, Fleet Air Arm. He flew faster than fear, and never stopped believing that the sky was worth saving. Visitors still walk past it today, some pausing to run their hands along the cold metal, wondering what kind of man could face death with that kind of courage. But those who listen closely, those who stand there long enough, sometimes swear they can still hear it. The faint, distant echo of a Merlin engine circling above, defying time itself. Because some legends never land.